In this video, I want to talk about 5 tips for helping a dismissive avoidant understand co-regulation. And I want to really use the dismissive avoidant perspective, the DA perspective here, because I think it's really important to understand the, valid parts of how we're all thinking about things from our own attachment styles. And so to do that, I actually asked my own partner some questions. He's secure, but leans DA sometimes in our relationship, less so now, after we've done a lot of work on our attachment styles. But I asked him from his perspective, thinking of sort of what sort of naturally comes to him when he thinks about this issue. Before I share his words with you, though, what is co-regulation? So one simple definition is that it's essentially how we can help each other to regulate our nervous systems and emotions in relationship. So back to my partner's words. What I did was just ask him in general, to share some thoughts on co-regulation and how that strikes him. Just hearing that word and the term, what are his sort of natural responses thinking about it in a relationship, particularly with me as his attachment figure, as his partner. And then I'm going to use those words to delve into some tips around them. So coming from the DA perspective here, and then digging in a little bit to each of the different parts of it. So I'm actually just going to go ahead and read this to you, his words, because I want to make sure I'm getting them right and not layering any of my own perspective onto them. So he said that he expects to be asked if I need something. He also said that he felt a resistance to feeling emotionally responsible for me when I talk about that term co-regulation, and a resistance to looking out for emotions in any way that feels like that feels like being responsible for my emotions. So he might notice if I'm upset, but doesn't want to feel responsible for them, and so therefore, would only give help if asked. And so he also mentioned that he takes people at their word if they say they're okay and that they don't need anything. So this is kind of our starting point here with these words from a dismissive avoidant. And I can say already that they're very representative. And as I get into the tips, you'll see why. So tip number 1, let's look at this piece about everyone should be responsible for their own emotions. This sounds very valid, right? I mean, it makes me think about concerns about codependency, for example. Like, we don't want to be codependent. And, essentially, are we responsible for other people's emotions? We aren't. So it's actually a very valid viewpoint. So the key here is to understand the difference between codependency, though, and co-regulation. So I really appreciated the definition of codependency that Stan Tatkin, who is a therapist, gives. And I think it really helps with this distinguishing. And it is that codependence is a one-directional thing. So someone is, sort of caretaking for or trying to guess the needs of or take care of the needs of someone else. And it's usually in the hopes that then they will receive it back. But it is in that one directional way. That doesn't mean the other person isn't part of the codependent relationship, but it is this one directional attempt to meet needs. And Stan Tatkin says, on the other hand, co-regulation is bi-directional. And it's also overt. It's actually something that, is explicitly stated as like, this is our relationship. We try as best we can to help meet each other's needs, for example. We try as best as we can to, be mindful of each other's sore points and things like that. So that's both like something that's an agreement as opposed to codependence, which is not explicitly stated like that. And it's bi-directional, like both people are agreeing to do that for each other. It's not one person doing it and then covertly hoping that the other person that they'll get something back from the other person. So hopefully that's a helpful distinction for everyone, including DAs who might be worried about codependence and that co-regulation at all means being responsible for someone else's emotions in a codependent way. So tip number 2 is to understand the core wounds at play. And I did ask a little further on this one, so I'll read you a couple more words from my partner here. So I asked him more about resisting feeling emotionally responsible for me, and he said that he feels a natural sense of responsibility and sometimes guilt, depending on if he feels like it involves him at all. And also that he feels that I might need something that he doesn't know how to give. So this right away gets into 2 very common core wounds for dismissive avoidance. The first one is a core wound related to that potential feeling of guilt, or that they, either that they did something wrong or that they've made a mistake, that kind of thing. Kind of a, just to put it really broadly, kind of some sort of an I am defective wound of some sort. And the second one is a helplessness that often DAs can feel, especially around emotions. And so that actually is a common core wound as well, an I am helpless core wound. So I think it can go a long way just to understand in any given situation for any of us where our core wounds are being touched. And in this case, in the feelings around the co-regulation and what that might mean, it's important for dismissive avoidants to understand their own core wounds that are at play. The third point I want to make, the third tip, is really taking a look at this sort of assumption that there's a neediness at play if someone else has needs, whether they're emotional needs or other needs. In this case, it's more emotional needs we're talking about, thinking if someone's upset, for example, if their partner is upset. And, dismissive avoidance can often view this as neediness, and it has this negative connotation. And my partner, mentioned that he's noticed that can trigger kind of a resentment, like, well, I don't have my own, I'm not allowed to have my own needs met, or something like that. And so this is, again, a really important thing to look at, like what is getting triggered in oneself, where you're not giving it to yourself, and that's why you're thinking of it that way. So this sort of independence and feeling like everyone needs to be independent that dismissive avoidants have can be at play here. And, absolutely, they're thinking that for themselves as well. And in particular, dismissive avoidants often associate being more vulnerable or having needs as being weak. So that's something to examine as well, because of course it's not true, right? We all have needs. And I think especially for a dismissive avoidant to acknowledge their own needs would be really helpful in stopping this association between having needs or having particularly emotional needs and it being sort of a neediness in this negative sense, and that having needs isn't a weakness. So tip number 4 gets into this piece where he said that he takes people at their word if they say they're okay or say they don't need anything else. Like, that's very valid, right? I mean, it's good to take what people say seriously and really listen to them and not make assumptions. However, it really can be worth doing a little bit of digging. Fearful avoidants in particular often need some digging before they can access more of their own vulnerability. And so I think it's important for everyone to realize, and dismissive avoidance in particular in this case, to just understand human nature, other attachment styles, but also just human nature too, that we have blind spots. We sometimes can't immediately access what we need. And so sometimes we just need a little help in that regard. All right, so my 5th and final tip is because this is about the dismissive avoidant perspective. So some of my partner's own words about what most helped him with regard to thinking differently about co-regulation. So he said that it really helps him if he can switch to being compassionate, tender, empathetic. What helps is to remember that it's not about him. And also it helps him if he thinks of it as someone else other than his partner. So thinking of it like a friend and realizing he maybe would do more for them. And so there's kind of 2 parts to this. So let me dig into them a little deeper. The part realizing that it's not about him is kind of that core wound part that I already mentioned, understanding, what it's triggering in him. But the new piece here is this idea of, well, what would I do differently for someone else, and how can I get into a more compassionate state? And I think the important thing to remember here is just the understanding of attachment and how we do treat our partners differently from other people because they are attachment figures, and because all of these attachment style nuances and aspects do come up in our closest relationships. And so really it's just having that wisdom and, maybe taking this bigger perspective of how am I treating my partner right now? How am I interacting with them? And would I treat someone else this way? Can be really useful. So finally, just to round out this video, I just wanted to get back to co-regulation a little bit. And, we've really come to understand how interconnected we all are in our relationships. We didn't used to always think that. It was maybe more back in the 70s, let's say, in psychology, it was much more about being independent. But, these days we've really discovered in a lot of different studies and just other modes of thought, how interconnected we really are. And it's honestly just a fact. So co-regulation is also not really something we're choosing in a way. It's something that we're already doing. We're just doing it in either a healthier way or not. I think of some studies they've done at the Heart Math Institute. We've often heard, I think, already about how babies and moms their hearts will entrain their heart rhythms. But it's really true more widely as well, as they've discovered in some of the studies at the HeartMath Institute. They've even discovered, they did some studies on a boy and his dog, and how they entrain their heart rhythms, and how the heart rhythms affect each other. When the boy left, then the dog had a more disorganized heart rhythm, and they thought that was maybe kind of separation anxiety. But and then how when the boy was sending loving thoughts to the dog and was coming into heart coherence himself, then the dog came into that heart coherence too. So this is all happening anyway, and so I think the importance here isn't about not co-regulating. We're already doing it, like I said. It's about being intentional about it and realizing that we really do affect each other in our close relationships. And that can be a really good thing if we're really intentional about it.